to start by asking if the committee has had a chance to review the minutes of our meeting on November 20th.
Move to approve.
Thank you. And a second. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you. Item number 3 on our agenda is the Task Force on Post-Secondary Online Education. Yesterday, the Innovation and Online Committee met and approved a report prepared by the Task Force on Post-Secondary Online Education, and I'd like to ask Governor Lautenbach to present a budget request issue that was included in that report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
As you said, during yesterday's Innovation and Online Committee meeting, the committee had an extensive discussion of the recommendations included in the final report of the Task Force on Post-Secondary Online Education in Florida and endorsed the staff's proposed implementation plan for those recommendations. One of those recommendations needs to be reviewed and hopefully approved by the Budget Committee. The Innovation and Online Committee recommended that the Budget Committee consider approving an amendment to the Board's 2014-15 legislative budget request to provide $250,000 to a lead institution to coordinate, deliver, and market at least 3 for-credit MOOCs, massive online open courses. These MOOCs would incorporate effective practices and competency-based assessments. The lead institution, in collaboration with the Board of Governors staff, would lead a statewide working group to draft a statewide MOOC strategy to recommend to the Board of Governors, including guidelines for the evaluation of non-credit MOOCs. As you may remember, the legislation passed a bill last year that required the Board of Governors and the State Board of Education to adopt rules that enable students to earn academic credit for online courses, including massive open online courses, prior to initial enrollment at a post-secondary institution. This LBR request will help us in that endeavor as well. The $250,000 was calculated after reviewing the cost of developing MOOCs that were not offered for credit and reviewing the cost determined by UF Online to be the cost for developing an online course using innovative pedagogy and/or technology. We also took into consideration that some MOOCs would come less for developing and piloting than others. Our best estimate was $250,000 for 2014-15, which the Innovation and Online Committee felt was a reasonable cost for this initiative. The Innovative and Online Committee recommends approval of this proposed amendment for the legislative budget request. Mr. Chairman, I move to amend the Board's 2014-15 legislative budget request to seek $250,000 for a lead institution to coordinate the offering of at least 3 for-credit, massive, open online courses that will include competency-based assessments, in which will, in collaboration with the Board of Governors staff, convene a statewide work group to develop a statewide strategy for MOOCs to recommend to the Board of Governors, including guidelines for the evaluation of non-credit MOOCs.
Second.
Thank you. There's a motion and a second to amend our legislative budget request to reflect this $250,000 increase. Are there any comments or questions? Hearing none. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Thank you, Vice Chair Lautenbach. Item 4 on our agenda is the report on 2013 new fees and tuition differential report. This is in accordance with the statutory direction, and this report must be provided to the legislature. Just a reminder to our committee that our board did not approve any new fees at our June 2013 meeting, and there were not any university requests to increase the tuition differential fee. So this report is presumably a very short report that we will be sending to the legislature referencing there were no fees or tuition increases. So if there are no questions, can I please have a motion to approve both reports?
I so move.
Second. Motion and a second. Any comments or questions? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries. Okay, item 5 is an update on the performance funding model. I would like to, before we get into this, thank everybody for the passion which seems to have, especially recently, become part of our conversation. So while we have been discussing performance funding, probably, I think, Mr. Chairman, before I was even on the board, and a lot of work has been done, I have sensed in recent weeks, as there's more and more discussion on the likelihood of performance funding, becoming a reality, that the passion has also escalated, and I'm very appreciative for that passion and want to thank everybody. It's been a long and challenging process, and so I thought I would take just a minute or two and have a trip down memory lane, so to speak. We started this whole idea of performance funding probably before the fall of 2012, but certainly by that point we were deep into it at the direction of former Chair Colson. Thank you very much, former Chair Colson.
You're throwing me under the bus on this one.
I appreciate you adding this to my assignments. So about 14 months ago, at his direction, we started this process, and we have had this topic on every committee agenda since that meeting in November of 2012. At each meeting, we've discussed the issues surrounding the model. We've reviewed materials on other state performance models. One slide that we all may recall, which I think is particularly helpful, is the slide, the map of the United States, with each state color-coded on where they are in the process of performance funding. And we are by no means blazing new trails in this area. We're probably in the middle of the pack in terms of what other states are doing. But I think it's been helpful to look at what other states are doing and learn from them. By learning from them, we've added a little meat to the bones each time, and what I really appreciated is that at each meeting we've had an open dialogue with our committee and with the presidents and with the provosts, asking for and receiving input at each meeting. The university provosts generally have a meeting during the same time we have our meeting. They've had this topic on their agenda several times as well, maybe every time, but it's certainly numerous times. They've participated in conference calls with board staff, a lot of emails back and forth, and as we develop the 10 metric system, I'm highly confident that the 10 metrics are not the 10 metrics that any one individual provost would have come up with. Collectively, they seem to have settled on that these were 10 metrics that they could live with, and understanding that none of them individually were going to be given the task that they got to pick all 10. I think they worked very well as a group to help the Board of Governors staff in preparing these metrics. Staff has spent a lot of time looking at other models, reading literature on various models, participating in national meetings to discuss and learn about performance funding, and even given that, we know that we don't have a perfect model. You'll recall our model has 10 metrics, 2 of those being discretionary, one picked by our board and one by the Board of Trustees of each university. In September, the board picked our metric, and at the November meeting, we approved the Board of Trustees metrics. We've directed staff to work with each university to set the benchmark for the 2 discretionary metrics. Staff communicated with each university about proposed benchmarks and received comments from about half of the universities. At the November meeting, we had a good discussion with the presidents regarding the model, and at that meeting, we directed staff, our committee directed staff to look at 3 changes to the model. Go to a 5-point system instead of our 3-point system, and this would allow a wider range of scores. Number 2, to determine a number of points, a minimum number of points the university must achieve before being eligible for new performance funding. And 3, to look at allocating a portion of each university's base funding pursuant to the model. And we'll hear more about those items that we asked Tim and his team to look at in just a minute. I think one of the things we've learned in the process is there's no perfect model. The model will be tweaked over time. I'm confident that we have a good starting point. And if you look simply, take for example Tennessee and Pennsylvania, we've looked at theirs. Their models are adjusted multiple times. And one of the points I think that is important to make is we could work forever to try to end up with a perfect model before we put the model in place, and then we would still put a model in place that isn't perfect and have to change it. So at some point, we just have to start playing the game, and I think the time has come that we do that. 2 other points, and then I'll turn it over to the Chancellor for any comments that he might like to make about this. It's important to remember, and the reason I'm stressing this is because I've had a few conversations over the past few weeks where this point, I think, was missed on some, is that the system is not simply based on achieving excellence in order to achieve funding. You can win by doing one of two things: achieving excellence in the 10 metrics or improving in the 10 metrics. So you're competing against yourself, not against any other university, because where you are today, if you get better tomorrow, regardless of what others do, you're competing for a pool of money. But from a score perspective, you actually have your own universities that have their own unique aspects. They're all different. The wage scale is different in Miami than it is in Pensacola. Each metric has aspects that make each university be able to say, yeah, but I'm different than that university. And the way we've built the model, so long as you improve yourself, then you have a chance of winning in this model. And I think, and that was Chair Colson, I think, was probably the first person to ask for that and helped us stay on point with that this is not simply about measuring against excellence, but measuring against improvement and picking whichever you actually did better at, improvement or excellence. And so that was a good push. The other point I wanted to make was what we're suggesting to the legislature, and I'm not, I don't know the nuances of how this actually would get written, but that proposing that our board be given the discretion, so while we would hope that our model would be accepted, that our board also be given the authority to make a change if common sense tells us that what we've built, which we thought was right, turned out to be wrong, and without having to go back to the legislature while they're in session, to change the legislation. So to be given that discretion, and we would hope we wouldn't use it, but if we needed to use it, that we would have the authority to use it, and that would be a little bit of a fail-safe measure to prevent some unintended consequences. Now, would that mean that we would use that authority because somebody wasn't going to get money? No. That's the whole design of the plan, is that universities, some will not get money. But if we had unintended consequences, that a metric didn't do what we thought it would do, there was the unavailability of data, who knows what the situation could be, but that we would have that authority, which hopefully we wouldn't have to use, but that we would use it if we could. So that is a backdrop. What I'm going to ask now is for our new chancellor, who has, I think, jumped right into the deep end on performance funding, and I'm appreciative of his efforts. And see, Chancellor, if you have any comments you'd like to add to mine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few thoughts that I would share. I guess one would be that while some would observe that I've only been on this job since January 6th, I would also let you know, and you've probably noticed this before, that with this staff, they don't let you rest for very long. I actually was retired from AT&T on December 30th, and during my retirement, I had lots of opportunity to learn a lot of materials as they were sent to me. And so I've had an opportunity, really, not only two things. One is to study this model, and then two, I had several opportunities last week to have conversations with our elected leaders about what their priorities are around higher education and where this discussion should go. I would say that from that, a few points I would make. Number one, I've looked at this board's strategic plan for 2025, and I've also looked at this board's expectations and the report that we saw yesterday on accountability and performance. And I believe that these metrics draw directly from not only our long-term goals, but also our short-term priorities as we try to understand how we best serve the citizens of Florida. I would also share with you that the inclusion of base in this is not, in my mind, and at this time, something that is intended, you talk about a carrot or a stick, it's actually about credibility. And I believe that our conversation with our elected leaders gains credibility when we have skin in the game. And so I believe that including base as well as incremental dollars in how these performance metrics are applied is critical to persuading our elected leaders and our Florida citizens that the investment we're asking them to make in our universities is also an investment that should receive the flexibility that each of the universities themselves will then implement in using those dollars to improve their service to their citizens, to their community, and to the state of Florida. I also am sensitive to a concern if a university loses money, that it not be perceived that that's taking their money and giving it to someone else. I remind myself, and I would remind all of us, it's Florida's money. And so I think it's important that we understand that what the conversation is about is how we best and most responsibly invest Florida's money in higher education. And I believe when we have that conversation with our stakeholders, again, we come back to a stronger level of credibility. The final point I would make, and at the time I accepted this position, I believe I talked to this board and to the university community about 3 priorities that I hold. 1 is access, 2 is accountability, and I think those 2 pretty clearly are contained within these metrics. The 3rd thing I talked about was academic excellence. And I believe that this model achieves academic excellence. It achieves the quality factor. Come back to, because our proposal is to grant to the universities the flexibility to invest the money that they are recognized with in performance funding, to go take it to the next level. It becomes the faculty member that's hired. It becomes the mentor or the tutor who is brought into the system. It becomes the internships that would be used in order to connect our students to future jobs. It becomes a whole lot of things I couldn't put on a list today, but I'm absolutely convinced that our 12 institutions have the knowledge and the wherewithal and the skills and the ability to influence their communities to use that money, invest in quality, and at the same time continue to build credibility in the Florida community. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I believe that as I've looked at this, and I will be responsible for advocating for this, I'm very comfortable with the work that's been done to date, and I want to thank you all for giving me a foundation that we can continue to build on.
Thank you, Chancellor. I think we have a good plan. I think it's also our responsibility to have a plan, because the legislature will, they will determine what they're going to do. It would be irresponsible for us to sit back and wait for them to tell us, we'd like to award you new money, and one of the additional components is that there's a base funding element. It would be irresponsible of our board to not have worked through a process as to how we would manage that. And so I think we have appropriately gotten ahead of this, and appreciate your comments of being supportive of it. I think we have to get to start playing the game now. So Tim, what I'd like to ask is for you to make your presentation, and the committee members and any members of the board should feel free to ask any clarifying questions as you go through, because I'm sure you'd be willing to entertain those both at the end of your presentation and during your presentation. So, thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, please interrupt me as I go along, and we'll try to clarify any issues that you may have. And before I get started, I do want to recognize 2 of our staff members who have been instrumental in working on this over the last year and a half, and that's Jason Jones, our Director of Institutional Research, who works in Jan's shop, and Dr. Jennifer Neighbors, our financial analyst, who works in my shop. So without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. So I just wanted to recognize them. Okay, I'd like to start off with this slide, which you have seen many times at our other presentations. I just want to go over the 4 guiding principles one more time, because this was the key to the whole development of the model, and you alluded to some of these, and the Chancellor did as well during your comments. We identified metrics that aligned with our strategic plan. That was our ultimate goal, is to make sure we were developing metrics or using metrics that were recognized in our strategic plan that were going to get us to 2025. and we wanted to reward excellence or improvement, as you said, Mr. Chair, and make sure that there is a balance between those universities who are excelling and those who are improving and being able to choose one side of the ledger or the other. And we wanted to have a few clear, simple metrics. You know, we have, and we heard from Jan yesterday about the accountability report and all the metrics that we monitor. And when we started this process a couple of years ago, I think we were at about 14 or 15 metrics, and we whittled those down to the 10 that we have now. And we also wanted to recognize the unique mission of the different institutions, and that gets to the board choice metrics, the one that this board has and the one that the Board of Trustees have. Here's another slide that you've seen on various occasions as well. These are the performance funding metrics. In your packet, Diligent Board Books, on page 373, there's a slide like this for each institution. You'll notice that metrics 1 through 8 are the same for everybody except for metric 8, which has a different one for new college since they do not offer graduate degrees. And then we have the 2 choice metrics. So in your packet, the slide for each institution has their individual university choice metrics on those along with the benchmarks. Now, you also notice that we have the 5-point system, which you directed us to do back in November. So we've gone from 3 points to 5 points. And also during that time, we worked on the benchmarks for the board choice and the BOT choice metrics, and those are reflected in those individual slides. So now I want to talk a little bit about the model itself and how we would appropriate new funding. Also in your packet on page 368 is a 2-page overview of the model itself with an example of how it would work, and I'll walk through that example in just a moment. Also in the packet on page 370 is a Q&A document, because we did receive lots of questions about why did you do this or why did you do that. We tried to answer those in that Q&A paper to satisfy some of those inquiries. So here's how the model works. We have 10 metrics. Each metric can receive a maximum of 5 points, so a total of 50 points are possible. To be eligible for new funding, you have to score 26 points or higher. Why 26 points? This is a performance funding model, so we felt like, at your direction also, that we had to establish a cutoff, and those who are performing highest would be eligible for new funds. This is the first year we've done this, so we set the cutoff at about the midpoint. If a university has 25 points or less, or is in the bottom 3, they would not be eligible for new funding. So you could have an instance when you have 3, 4, or 5 universities who score 25 points or less who would not be eligible. Or you could have a situation where everybody scores more than 26, but we would still look at the bottom 3 lower performers who would not be eligible for new funding. Once we determine the points, then we're looking at allocating the funding, and you'll recall this board approved a $50 million legislative budget request. So there's a 2-step process on allocating the funds. First, we would look at what each institution's base is to the total base of the system. So we're doing a proportional allocation initially. We looked at it this way because we didn't want any one university to be disproportionately advantaged or disadvantaged over another one. So that would give everybody an amount who's eligible for new funding, a percentage of the funds equal to their base percentage. If there's any funding left over, which there will be because you have some universities who are not eligible for new funds, those funds are then allocated based on the top performing institutions. So if you have 3 universities who do not receive or not eligible for new funds, you would have 3 who would be eligible for an additional funds. So let me kind of walk through how it would work. There's an example in your packet. I think it's on page 369. So it's an example distribution of new funds using 5 universities. And you can see in column A, the points for each of the institutions. Column B is the base funding for each institution. And this is the base state funds. This does not include student tuition. This is just general revenue and lottery. Column C is the percentage of that institution's base to the total funding. So then column D gets to our first step on the allocation process. So you have the first 2 universities who scored 25 points or less. They are not eligible for new funding. Universities C, D, and E are eligible. So the first step is you would take their percentage of the base allocation times the $50 million. So you can see University C at 8.3% of the $50 million gets about $4.1 million. University D about 12.4, University E $19 million. So that utilizes about 35 of the $50 million that's available in new funding.
So Tim, is it fair to say that, another way to say it is, the bottom 3 would get 0, the middle of the pack get their proportional amount based on their funding to the total base funding, and the top 3 would get that proportional funding plus the distribution, the excess distribution from the bottom 3?
That would be great, yes. So column D gives you the total amount that's allocated based on their base, and column E provides an additional allocation to your top performing institutions. In this example, it would be the top 2, and then those funds are allocated based on the actual points that you earn. So there's where scoring high in the point system helps benefit you, because then you end up with a new total in column F, and you can see what that percentage would be in column G. So for University C, they received an amount equal to their base, whereas University D and F received an additional amount because they were one of the top performing institutions. So that's how the new funding model, our allocation would work. Yes, sir.
Let me pause you a minute. We may need a little extra description because some of the diligence updates didn't show up on all of our iPads.
Did you sync?
Yeah, well, it's just not here.
Okay, well, let's just see, based on his description and my,
Okay.
so,
Be more descriptive.
all right. Go ahead.
So the top, when you get to the top 3, in your example, since if the bottom 3 aren't going to get any funding and the top 3 will then get the additional funding at the end, is that going to also be proportional, did you say, to their base funding, or will that additional funds be done differently?
Those additional funds are done based on their points. So we'll look at the individual, those 3 universities' points, and do a proration based on the total points for those 3 institutions. So it's a different proportional amount based on their actual points.
Okay, thank you.
So that's where performing higher benefits you as a top-performing institution.
All right, you want to move on to the next?
Okay. Okay, the next slide gets at the base allocation. Since we're asking for $50 million in new funding, we're going to use the $50 million from the base as our example. So $50 million would come from the system. So a proportional amount would come from each institution's recurring base funding of general revenue and lottery. $50 million is about a 3% allocation from each institution. Since this is the first year that we're doing this, we did put a ceiling on how much an institution could potentially lose of 1%. So even though we're taking 3% and running it through the model, the most any institution would lose would be 1% this first year.
So, said this way, I think, Tim, equal amount, 50 million of new money equals 50 million of base, except it, in this first year, it really doesn't, because we're putting I still haven't decided what the right word is, restrictor plate or bumpers or something on the maximum amount any one university could be impacted to only 1%, even though the 50 million actually represents 3%. So the thought is eventually that restrictor wouldn't be there, but in recognition of it's the first year, we want to make sure we're that we test drive this a little bit, and yes, there would be an impact, but that we've limited the impact to 1% at the maximum versus 3%.
Have you decided, is that stopgap or whatever word you're using, is that only for 1 year, or has that not been determined yet?
It hasn't been determined, so the thought is it's for the first year.
Right, but-
We'll see how we're doing.
Okay.
And that ultimately, the feedback we're hearing from the legislature is that if base funding is to be impacted, it's to be impacted. I'm suggesting we should limit that now, but then look at it next year and
Okay.
either say, yeah, we think we ought to do that again, or maybe not.
Okay.
But so it's a 1-year thought.
And the legislature controls the allocation of the base to each institution, so they have a big say in how this process will work. So using the point system for new funding, for the base funding, if you scored 26 points or more, you would get your entire base funding restored. So if we're taking 3%, you would get your 3% back. If you're 25 points or less, you get 2% of the 3% back, so that leaves the 1% at risk. Then the 1% is then reallocated in a similar way that the new funding is to the institutions who score 26 points or higher. So that's how the model works, Mr. Chair.
Using the same metrics and
Same metrics, same methodology.
So if everybody scores 26 points, then everybody just gets, there's no change.
Everybody gets a proportion.
that's right. If everybody scored 26 points,
Then everybody just
then you
gets-
just get, base funding would be just what it started at.
Right.
The new money would still be impacted.
Right, new money would be impacted, but as long as everybody gets 26 points, we really didn't make any changes at all to base.
So the only other part I would add, and I stated it earlier, Tim, but the discretionary component that this committee would be given the authority to protect us against unintended consequences, that we could make adjustments that would then come to the full board. And I think it would be appropriate, even if we made any of those adjustments, to then be submitted back to the legislature that said, we actually made an adjustment to the system that we had, and here's what it is, just so that we're fully disclosing if we made any changes. More comments, Tim?
No, that concludes my
Okay,
presentation.
so would love to hear any feedback from the committee or any other board members and see where this takes us.
Mr. Chairman, I haven't read all the material and all the press out there, and being new here, this is not something we're pioneering. This is happening all over the country.
Correct.
And frankly, we're just, impresses me that we're just kind of catching up at this point.
Yeah, I think we're reacting. The President of the United States has suggested performance funding and has even suggested metrics. I think there are 4 metrics the President has suggested, and I think 3 of the 4 are actually in our group. So, and universities and states all over the country are implementing this, or have implemented it.
Yeah.
And they're tweaking it as they go as well.
Sure.
Mr.
Yes.
Chairman, I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Going back to the passion that you were discussing earlier and that you brought up about members of this board or potentially other stakeholders, did you receive any of the same passion from any of the legislators that, if you've spoken to, the same question would be posed to the Chancellor as well? I think the passion exists because we're talking about including base funding, and I would ask, did we receive any potential negative feedback, or do you intend to receive any potential negative feedback, considering some of the members of the legislature worked pretty hard to restore some of the base funding in some of our schools?
I don't know what, so I'll answer, and then Chancellor, you can answer as well. I don't, and the Chairman, I don't know what to expect. I can tell you, at this point, the feedback I have received is that if we are asking for and expecting new money, that base funding must be included. because there's this element of wanting the universities, wanting to invest in our system, wanting to give us new money, but needing to have a process to ensure that we are improving in the metrics and in the areas that we have all identified are important. And so I think the feedback I've heard is if we want new money, this has to be considered part of it. Now, so Chairman?
What I would add is that I have met with the legislatures, and I mean, all of them. They say, look, if you want new money, you know, you have to have a skin in the game. All of them. Now, actually, what Chairman Kuntz is doing is putting the restrictor plate on. We're the one being careful. We want to be very careful about how we do this process and make sure we don't harm our universities, but to be sure that there is going to be a skin in the game, and legislators are very interested, in performance funding.
I would echo the same. I think that if anything, I have at times sensed that they feel like we're being too cautious.
Yeah.
I would also say in discussions with the business community, I think that this construct is something that has been talked about for several years, and the movement to a output-based funding rather than an input-based funding model is embraced, not only because that may be the way a lot of people in business think about this, but also they recognize the fact that you actually enable a lot of creativity when you don't tie everything to, trying to dictate what a project is and come up with what outcomes or goals would be and work toward those.
Chairman, you touched on this earlier, that restrictor plate that Chairman Hussaini brought up, do we have any intention to lift that in the following years? I know you said it's going to be a one-year.
I think we have to just look at it each year. I mean, I made that up. Yeah, I just thought, let's make sure we've built something that's fair and doesn't measure things. We think these metrics are good, but maybe there's a couple that aren't, and it creates an output that's just wrong.
Yeah.
So let's be careful. Now, as Chairman said, I'm getting some pushback from the legislature saying, no, don't do that. But I am committed to suggesting we put that in, and then I think we look at it next year and we can decide, do we like that? Was it a good thing, a bad thing, or what?
Well, and I would recognize that because in the reports that were sent out, it does recommend to put in stopgap measures like that 1%.
Yeah.
But going back to a number of studies that university provosts have continued to cite, is putting base funding in jeopardy after a number of recessionary years really the direction we want to go in, considering that new money has just been available in the legislature just, what was it, the last year?
Yeah, I mean, so, go ahead, Chance.
I guess I would argue that we all should recognize that base funding is in jeopardy every year. And I say that because if we went and added up all of the things that people are going to the Florida legislature and to the governor and saying are important right now, there's not enough, even in a good year, to do all the things that everybody thinks is important. And so what we establish through this is a credibility around why the priority for higher education is not only for continuing a level of funding, but actually increasing a level of funding. A lot of what we're hearing is, be prepared to change that conversation and recognize that we go through that list. They have to balance a budget at the end of the day, and we have to fight for our seat at the table. I believe this gives us the best tools for us to go and fight for our seat at the table when we go through that process.
I completely understand. I wrote a letter to the Tampa Bay Times, I think 2 weeks ago, saying how commending the example the legislature set this last session in investing in our schools. And you mentioned accessibility in your remarks earlier. Do we believe that incorporating base funding will have unintended consequences to that accessibility that we're looking at? Because if we do cut base budgets, tradition has been that we need to find revenue elsewhere. And being the student on this board, I'd have to beg that question.
I would respond to that. In any business, it's not just our revenue. You can cut expenses.
Of course.
So you go find, it's no different than anything else. Any businessman in this country that when they don't have the revenue, you go find, and our universities have done that. And that's where it is. You look at the programs that are not beneficial, they don't bring the income, and you start cutting, and that's where we're going. So they have to relook at the program. So the notion of, you cut the base, what do we do? Well, like anybody else in this country, like any family, when the income is not there, that you have to go back and look at your system. So it's not about getting revenue from somewhere else. Now, that could be a part of it, getting revenue, but you also need to look at your operation, your efficiencies, and the programs that are not beneficial.
I think I would add to that, Chairman, that I don't expect there to be unintended consequences. It could be, who knows? What I expect there to be is a change in behavior. This will change how we run our universities. And I think that change will be a change for the good. And I think that the other thing it will do is it will give confidence to the legislature that they can continue to appropriate more and more and more additional funding because of this.
Okay.
So I think it's definitely going to cause behavior changes. Okay. I don't know that those are negative.
The only thing I would add, Carlo, is if we don't do this, I believe they're going to do it. And if we don't step in and say, here's the way we suggest, we recommend you handle the base funding performance metrics, then, because everything I'm hearing, it's going to happen. And we're going to let them do it. And I think they could use our help and guidance on this. I think we couldn't be more careful. I mean, Tom spent thousands of hours studying this. So I think it's better for us to be engaged and out front than to sit back and watch it happen to us.
And again, please, Skip, I don't want to, no, please, Skip.
First and then.
Governor Chopra, go ahead.
Thank you. My question is the process. I know the model has been out there for a while, Mr. Chairman, but the rules of the game have just been established.
Right.
And I think normally any person gets a chance to read the rules and then decide how they will approach it.
Right.
To immediately implement this as soon as we establish the rules seems to be a year, in my opinion, ahead of time.
Yeah.
It's important for us to let the metrics be out there and then follow up with maybe a year of performance to see how the institutions will adapt, what changes will be made, and how they can approach the metrics.
I would say a couple things, and then, Chairman, you may want to as well. First of all, I think what Chairman Colson said is right. So if we don't do something, then we're going to live with what somebody else created for us. But these are not new metrics. We've been receiving the work plans
Yes.
every year. These metrics came from those work plans. So it's not that these metrics are new metrics. We're going to be looking at them differently. But we've been hearing, what do we need to do to get better with these metrics? I mean, I've been on the board 2 years, certainly for those 2 years, and I think before then. So I approach it that there comes a time when you just have to start. And we're not starting with unknown factors. We're starting a little bit with an unknown outcome. But these metrics are not new to any university. Chairman, you...
Yeah, that's exactly what we have done this year. We didn't, hold any university back. We went ahead, and believe me, we got a pushback. That we gave you new money. You were supposed to, select the best, but you went ahead and divvy up the money. So we did get our pushback, and we did do that, just what you just said. So the first year, that's what we've done. Now, this is going forward for this coming year for 14-15.
Okay. Can I have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman? nature of the money that's going to go back, is that going to be recurring money?
So, Chancellor, you may want to address this, but the answer is, I think the answer right now is, don't know.
And I would agree with that. I think that that is a very legitimate conversation that we need to have with our elected leaders. The conversations that Vice Chairman Kuntz and I have had is that the intent of this model is that this would be recurring money because the types of things we're looking to improve are not one-time projects. These are investments in long-term performance. And so our belief is, but we need to have that conversation, and I will be honest and tell you that's one I've been diving into, from someone who has not had to work through state appropriation processes. So I'm trying to apply logic, and I'm finding I have to just learn a new process. But our belief is, yes, that this is a building block approach to funding for higher education, and that recurring dollars are necessary. Again, if we're talking about people and professors and tutors and internships, you do those one time and stop, then we should expect the outcomes to happen one time and stop. And this is a model for continuing performance growth.
So we hope so. And
If I got a vote.
one other point is, I believe we have to give greater flexibility to the universities on how we spend our dollars too, because each dollar seems to. One of the things I've learned is, you have a dollar, and instead of it being a dollar, it's 100 pennies that each have to be allocated a certain way, and it ties the hands of the universities to actually make some of the decisions that we're suggesting should be made on reallocating resources. And so, I've talked to the Chancellor and to the Chairman, not sure exactly how that happens, but I think we have to work towards greater flexibility on how money can be spent. So a dollar is a dollar.
If I may just wrap up with a comment, what Governor Fassi said about unintended consequences, I think I'll be a little bit more specific. I think if the money is taken away from those institutions that are what we consider performing poorly, it's difficult to improve their performance unless a major paradigm shift takes place out there. And if that's our consequence, then that is an intended consequence. But if it's not, because we're not getting rid of what you may consider units in a business, we're not eliminating anybody. So to improve them, to take away money from those that are performing poorly, may actually cause them more harm. That's the unintended consequence, I think.
I appreciate the comment. Governor Link?
Just maybe something we want to clarify, to the extent that I think a lot of people will use our frequently asked questions to try to understand this, and probably in the legislature. There's one part of it says, to be eligible for funding, a university must score 26 points or higher and not be in the bottom 3. And it sounds like that's not necessarily exactly how it's working, so we probably want to fix that.
That's on the new money.
But that's not specified in
Okay.
here.
Okay.
So I just think
Good
we need
clarification. So,
to
Tim, you
clear that up,
catch that?
because
Yeah.
it would appear that you would lose your base funding
Right.
as well.
No, that's right. That's
So,
for the new
For
money.
bottom 3, so I just think we need
So
to fix that.
that's to react to a requirement that we've been told is important, that there have to be new money universities, some that would get no new money.
And I think that's fine. I
That's
just
a good
think that
clarification.
people are going to read that and think that they're going to lose their base funding here if they're bottom
Tim,
3.
you got that? Yeah. So other questions from the board or the committee? And
I have another question, Chairman.
Yes, sir.
The $20 million that were distributed at our September meeting, I believe it was, what happens with that? Does that stay recurring in the university's budgets, or is that
Great question.
going to be
Chancellor?
redistributed?
It's not clear, and I would just, in brevity, I would repeat the argument I already made. I believe that the best and proper way going forward would be to have that included as recurring money.
I would agree.
that's what we want.
I would agree.
But as we talk about sums and totals, we're going to have to be very careful to work our way through it and make sure that we've protected that and made that argument.
Okay. Was this model proactively shared with the university administrations, more importantly, the vice president of administrations or the university provost before last week?
I think, to be fair, not in its entirety. I mean, certainly the metrics, and then at the last meeting, we talked about base funding being impacted.
Inclusion of base, yes.
And so that shouldn't have been a surprise. I think all of the nuances, I don't think so, Tim, until maybe last week. Is that about a week ago? Yeah. So I think that's the answer to that. Yes, sir, Governor Morton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Those of us that have run companies, I think, are pretty accustomed to metrics and being held accountable. And I think really what we're launching is a long-term journey. And that journey is cultural, and as much as it is mechanical. And we can concentrate and look at what we see, and what we see is, in the short term, a year-to-year performance-based means for achieving some additional funding. But really what is underway is a cultural shift that's starting with the President of the United States that has to do with accountability in education. Is this perfect? No. Will this evolve over time? Yes. But what it will do, and I think we also have to recognize there's great discretion still at the university level as respects funding sources, having to do with finance companies, having to do with endowments and how foundations support those universities. A great deal of flexibility. So how assets are allocated and resources are allocated is one of the toughest decisions, and that's up to the presidents and the CEOs of those universities. But I think the most important message we're sending, Mr. Chairman, is cultural, that a culture of accountability, a culture of teamwork, of working with the legislature, the Board of Governors, the presidents of the universities together, we can make a difference. Because if we don't, we're going to get the same kind of results we have been in the past. And I, for one, want to participate in changing this for the future and for the better of the students and the taxpayers of the state of Florida. So, again, it's not perfect, but I applaud the work the chair has done, staff has done, and I think it's a great first step.
Thank you, Governor. Governor Huizenga, did you have any?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, yes, sir.
I kind of view this as the Board of Governors and the system now taking part in the direction we want the universities to go. Previously, we encouraged people to go in different directions, but we had no stick, no money out there to make sure that they were hearing us and that they were agreeing. And so what you had is we sat here and said, we would like this, we would like that, we would like to see you improve here, we would like all of these things, but universities could say that's fine, but they could go their own direction, and there wasn't anything that we were really impacting them on by doing that. Now what we're saying is we do want to have some control of the system. We believe that certain things in the system we need to achieve, and so we're asking the universities to partner with us to make that happen. Those that decide not to do that, okay, will not get the extra funding that the system will control, and they'll leave it on the table. If they decide to join the system in progressing that way, then they're going to benefit from it. So the choice is still a little bit theirs, but we have more of the golden rule. The guy with the gold makes the rule.
Governor Huizenga, did you?
I did not have a question, Mr. Sorry.
A comment in my last question, I promise.
Yeah, sure.
I'll even move the
No, that's
item
good.
if there's nothing else.
Yeah.
I do believe, Governor Morton, it is a culture change, and incentivizing our institutions to be as efficient and abiding by the metrics and working their hardest to perform on these metrics is important. And when we distributed the $20 million that the governor had proposed in those three metrics in the last year's session, I expressed concern on the fact that everyone was a winner, and performance metrics have to be about winners. Right. It looked very much like a pizza pie, and we gave out everyone a fair slice. And I expressed my concerns, however, still voted in favor of it because of the nature of the request. But I don't believe this should be about losers, and that's why I question the policy of including base funding in here. My last question. You talked, Mr. Chairman, about discretion that this board would have over the redistribution of base funding, what would we do, and I'll give two examples, with institutions that receive national accolades, are posted very well done on our BOG social media, like New College, that has its graduates working across the country, that should they receive a cut in their base, would that send the right message to those across the country? Or a university that has marginal reserves and would have a serious impact to the student body should they receive a cut in their base? What I'm asking is there more defined model in how it is we will use discretion? And if not, can we have our board staff work on that and potentially present it at our next meeting?
We have intentionally not done that. The intent would be to never use that discretion, okay? It is not, okay, so we have the ability, so now let's sit around at the end of the year and really decide how we want to divvy it up. Because if we did that, then why do we have a model at all? If we make it up at the end of the year. And so the intent is we never want to use that discretion. It would not be, well, this might send the wrong signal. So this is not to get into any one particular university's issue, because I think that could take us down a slippery slope here. But, it's just, well, that's going to look bad for that university. That's not a reason to use the discretion. Because you know what? There's going to be, by design, in a scoring system, some universities that score more than others, and because the one that scored the lowest isn't going to look good, well, that's the way the system is built. So we wouldn't use discretion in that situation, because then if we would, why have this? So to me, it's more of a fail-safe on something just didn't work. It's not that we didn't like the answer. It's that the answer that we got was determined by inaccurate, inappropriate inputs, not that the system worked well and, boy, that's going to hurt somebody's feelings. So I think you have to be careful on defining exactly how you use discretion, because then you don't have discretion anymore. If we had a rule book that said under these situations we will then do this, well, then we just put that in the model and say we actually have no discretion. Is that answer your question?
I believe it'd be sending, quite honestly, I believe it'd be sending the wrong message to some of the institutions. But again, that's why I believe there shouldn't be losers in this model. And I'm done with that.
Governor Chopra.
Mr. Chairman.
Your last question. No, I'm teasing.
They come as we go along, and it's a follow-up to what Governor Tripp said. Have we been able to determine what the actual base funding should be, what the cost is? We are working with a moving target that has moved down, essentially. And so we're just saying that this is our current base funding and this is where we should go. But have we actually looked into the system as a system to decide what the right base funding should be?
So my answer is we haven't done that because we don't control the base funding. Now, I suppose we could have an exercise of what would we like base funding to be. All we've done is said there is base funding. So whatever that is, let's build a system that uses whatever the legislature appropriates as base funding. Obviously, we don't control what that is, so if we did, we would all, if we each had the pot of money that was base funding, and each of us individually were asked, why don't you distribute that the way you think it should be distributed, we'd all come up with a different answer. The legislature comes up with that answer, and it would be nice if they would come up with an answer that had lots more money in that base. But I don't think that was appropriate in this exercise to come up with what should the base be. This is simply whatever the base is, let's apply the system. And then I personally hope that base is a whole lot higher than it is today.
I'm hoping as we have a new chancellor and as we go forward that we continue to work on a balance of tuition and base as well as what the real base should be.
I agree. And the other thing is we've simply chosen the distribution of the base. How much does each university have as a percent of the total? We just accepted that as a given. You could also argue not just how big is the base, but why is it distributed the way it's distributed? And I thought we can't get into that because there is no right answer. It's only an answer on it is what it is.
But my question was, if I may just finish up with what Governor Tripp said, brought this along. If we want to take more ownership of the system and start asserting our role, it's good to know what the parameters are.
And I think, I agree with that. I just think that's separate than the model itself. I think separately, the chancellor, I think, starting with the chancellor and maybe the chairman, would be our strongest advocates of understanding what should the base be and trying to encourage the process to have a result that the base is a whole lot bigger than it is today. So I think at this point, what we are looking to do is actually have this model be accepted as the model that we would report to the legislature, that we have a model that we would use if they were to appropriate new money and also have a base funding implication.
Move it.
There's a motion on the floor.
Second.
And a second. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, there's a question from...
Yes, sir. Mr. President.
I apologize for interrupting. I want to say that, is it perfect? Well, no. I think when there's actual jobs data, we'll see a significant change. We're missing a huge portion of our students in terms of employment, and I know that makes a big difference for any university that has a set of students that go out nationally, that the percentage of employment almost exactly mirrors my distribution of alumni, all 300,000 of them. So I know a third of them are missing. Okay, is this a significant improvement? I think it's a substantial improvement in terms of the metrics that we're using. Is it important to do? Absolutely, it's important to do. I believe, as you do, that if we don't do this, there will be almost no way to get new dollars into the system. We have to demonstrate that we're following performance metrics. Should we have skin in the game? I think, as much as I would never want to give up money, we have to have skin in the game, or that's not going to work either. We have to show that we're committed. I think the one key issue here, and I'm not a university that would lose money, the one key issue here is that I believe your objective is to force improvement of the system, to force universities that are not working in an area well to allocate funds to make sure that they work better in the future. And if this is the objective, it's quite a worthy one. It is, in fact, a steering mechanism. The problem is that with so many cuts in a row that have occurred, that to take a cut, that institution is unlikely to be able to reallocate, because you're essentially doubling the cut in order to move dollars from one area to another. This is particularly true since so many of these metrics are difficult to steer. It takes 6 years to modify your 6-year graduation rate. It takes, most universities would tell you that the percentage of jobs of your current graduates is almost completely and totally out of your control as an institution. You do better, you eventually do better in that area. The number of STEM graduates next year is almost clearly set already by the number of juniors that you have or STEM graduates. So the institutions are going to have trouble steering these metrics to a point where they can add improvement. So my suspicion is you got multiple years to have really significant impact that would occur. So this presents the likelihood that all those universities at the bottom will lose every year. First they're 1% and then continuing. And since all the cuts have come out of the E&G budgets and not the rest of the university, to be able to lose money there and steer it into a new direction, that becomes a significant problem for the institution. So my bet is they will cut, they won't reallocate. So if the objective truly is to look at each university and say, this is the direction we want you to go in, and we want to see improvement, we want to see a better jobs effort, we want to see a better graduation rate, we want to see the accessibility change, then we have to make sure that those institutions have an opportunity to reallocate. So in my view, you have three choices if you want to do this well. And I'm absolutely serious. I'm accepting every part of this, even though not all these metrics work well for Florida State, okay? One is to make sure that the funds from last year are recurring. Because if you do that, then you've given the institutions a little breathing room to be able to move forward and reallocate okay, so that's one. The second, as you alluded to, is to make our institutions more fungible. Quite frankly, I've never been at a place in which the fees almost equal our tuition, and there's so many fees, and they're all in set buckets. So as the cuts to E&G occurred, which were 25%, huge number for any business if we operated as a business. No business has every single dollar tagged for a particular purpose. So all the dollars came out of E&G while our fees were allowed to go up 5% a year. So that meant I had a little bit more money each year to wire the university, I had a little bit more money for my health fee, I had a little bit more money for my student activities fee, and my educational budget went down and down. So we've gotten to the point where you have the most inflexible system that you can imagine to manage. And that prevents a president from steering, because you cut from one pot that's getting smaller and smaller, and you cannot use any of the other pots. If we had one color of dollar, like a good business, we would sit there and say, you know something, I've got to do better on my retention rates. This requires this staff. I'm not going to use my technology fee this year. Those things can be delayed so that I can move those dollars into an area that impacts the metrics that you have set. That creates an institution that is more flexible. We have incredibly inflexible institutions with an E&G budget that's getting smaller and smaller. I will give you another example.
I agree.
I will give you another example of how other states do this. You can take the example of Texas, where literally you can make the decision to decrease a fee and increase your tuition as long as it's cost neutral to your student. That says, I'm lowering this fixed cost element here. We're taking half the university and we can't impact the budget in order to address the educational issue. So I could decrease a fee and increase my tuition, have it cost neutral to a student, and I actually get to recover from a cost cut because I've decided the academic and retention problems are the most important. So that's a second way to fix this problem. There's a third way, and that is not to take the money that you take from another institution and give it to a different institution. I think, personally, this isn't going to play well as a story, okay, that institutions that are struggling, or maybe they serve a lot of military, or whatever, are losing money so that a wealthier institution can get it. I don't think that's a good press story. But here's an alternative, and that is, okay, you take that institution X that is not performing well, and you take the money and say, okay, what are you cutting? Now you cut it. Now you write a proposal to get that money back by reinvesting that money into the area that helps change those metrics. That's a case where you have created that carrot and stick, but you're insisting that that university improve by taking from the bottom and adding to the top in a way that you agree to it. Now this is a way where, because a reallocation tries to steer a system, but I think those bottom universities will lose every year, this is a way instead you steer the institution by forcing its performance. So I just give those as three ideas by which the skin in the game portion of it could actually do what you want to do.
I appreciate your comments,
Yeah.
and we're almost out of time, but it's just to answer the first two. I mean, all three are excellent points, particularly, I really think we have to figure out how to make the money be more fungible, because if you can reallocate,
You can be successful.
you can do a lot of things, and if there's a minor cut, not a major cut, but a minor cut, but you can reallocate, I think it's just so much easier to do. And so I appreciate all your comments. Chairman, any other comment before I'm out of time?
Yeah, just real quick, I agree with you. Now, on the first and second. On the third one, you're absolutely right. But make no mistake, we're going to be going and saying very strongly, what have you done? It'll be a deep dive to make sure it's done. So that's something to be worked as we go forward. Now, as far as, trying to make sure what we've done last year is reoccurring, I absolutely agree with you, and we're definitely going in that direction.
And I'm pleased that the Chancellor is so good and because couldn't agree with you more on that, and the Chancellor's taken that on as one of his top priorities, and knowing, as we all know, how good he is, I'm confident that he's going to be able to have that be achieved.
Now I know how you felt when Dean passed this on to you.
Governor Beard, I'm within a minute of...
I'll be real quick. I had a conversation with Dr. O'Shea yesterday, and I'd just like to hear from him. I know he's got a very special institution that is very small, has very little flexibility, and he's got some concerns, and I just want to hear from him. And
President O'Shea, would you like to say a few things?
I'm for this, but...
Trying to knowing that I'm also about to run into the chairman's time here.
Sure. I'd like to second what President Barron said there. We've known this is coming. We're bought into it, into performance funding. I went out and told my faculty that we likely will not do well this year, but that means no extra money. And the year after, there will probably be budget reallocation. We'll also agree in some ways with budget reallocation done well, because the amount of money is finite, and you just can't keep going up. Also went to our legislative delegations and said we support the state university system's request for $50 million more in performance funding. When I did that, though, I had no conception that I was putting my own or other institutions at risk this year. It's come as a deep surprise. The day before yesterday, in terms of the question of when we got the details of the model, we've either got 25 or 26 points, depending whether or not we can find one more Pell Grant student. We have one program. A 1% cut is not, there was an analogy that is like 99 cents out of a dollar. Of course you can take that. But for the last 3 years, this is the first year that New College has not used reserves to pay for recurring expenses. We are down on fumes. We are hitting the statutory minimum. This kind of the making the 20 million recurring would fix this in some ways, but I do wonder if having, in addition, we know we have to reallocate, but we were talking about that starting a year out when we got a little more experience with this. I'm also worried about one of the great things about the state university system of Florida is its diversity. We've got some great research institutions. We've got great metropolitan universities. We've got some fantastic regional comprehensive universities. We've got one of the nation's finest historically black colleges, universities. We've got the National New College in National Arts and Science College, a very different model. That diversity of institutions, it's not an institutional thing. It allows us to better serve our children, the students of Florida. Most Floridians aren't ever going to go to New College, but but having that range of choices that's what's best in some ways for our taxpayers. So it's not a kind of institutional fur fight. I do fear that implementing and I hate this metaphor, the skin in the game, but this year I just question whether that part is necessary. I do understand that we have to reallocate. We can promise to reallocate next year, but not. And two of the institutions I think that are probably not in the money this year, they don't have presidents here. and they survey another group. So we're going in the right direction. Sometimes haste does incredible damage, though. And I don't want to slow things down with process. I mean, I get that all the time on my own campus. But I am worried about the effects of the base this year. So let us stop
Thank you,
there.
President Shea. So we have a motion and a second on the floor to accept this. And is there any further discussion by any of the committee members? All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. We have one no, Governor Fossey. Motion carries. Thank you very much. I would also like to say we're in this together. We are in this to help our system, to get more money for our system, and so I think, speaking on behalf of the whole committee and working with the chairman, I think we're all in this together, Chairman. Right. So thank you. I think there's no other items on our agenda. Any other committee member have anything they want to talk about? Hearing none, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Okay, we will promptly start at 10 o'clock, the main board meeting.